All right. Ready?
I was born ready, Luke.
All right. How you doing, everybody? My name is Luke.
And my name is Mark.
And this is Friday Questions. So we got a couple of questions from the last 2 weeks going through Romans, and we have one question from the wandering mind of somebody who lost focus during the teaching in Romans. Either way, we appreciate the questions.
And that's not us guessing. It's a he, sorry. We won't say his name, though, but he confessed that it kind of got locked into his brain, and until he sent it to us as a question, he really couldn't refocus. So that was also for you, Pastor Ray, to let you have someone back in to the fold.
So if you're sitting there this weekend and just something is gnawing at you and you're like, well, why, how come they don't mention this in the Bible? You just fire that question off to us.
And then clear your mind.
Clear your mind, know that we'll answer it, then you can get back to listening to the message.
Exactly.
So the first question is our out of the blue, this thing just popped into my brain and I can't think about anything else. And it is, what was Noah's real name? And if it wasn't Noah, what was it?
So as much as we can tell, Noah was the name of the individual he's like mostly in Genesis like 6 through 9 in Noah. Noach in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's got like a CH on the end
it
of
does.
it.
And no, I didn't know that. I looked it up. But then I remembered as I looked it up from my years ago of doing a little bit of Hebrew. Like I know just enough Hebrew and Greek to make me really dangerous.
Yeah.
But I think I know more than I do.
Yeah.
So Noah, the name Noah means rest or comfort, which is pretty great because like think about that, Luke. How does Noah's name fit into the narrative of the flood account?
Yeah, I mean, God told him to build an ark, and I mean, maybe it wasn't so restful during the storm, I guess.
Maybe not.
But afterwards, God provided rest to creation after the flood went down, I guess.
Yes. And I mean, in many ways, the ark saved them. The ark was a restful, comforting place for them in the midst of, again, we could get in the nuance of this, but one of the questions I always have in the back of my mind is, if this is one of just the first times that something like a flood occurred in these people's lives, like I wonder what that experience would be like when suddenly there's water everywhere.
Yeah.
And you suddenly realize you can't swim forever.
Well, you know what's funny, and we're veering off a little bit already.
We'll come back.
I mean, it's kind of on topic. I have heard a lot of people say how in multiple history, what's the right word? Not folklore, not history.
There's multiple accounts of a flood narrative.
Type event.
Yes.
Narrative. Yeah, there's in other societies, other nations, there are flood narratives, and some people will use that to be like, see, Christianity is not real.
The Bible ripped it off.
Everybody has something like this.
Right.
But when I think about it, I think about, well, if everybody talked about a flood that happened, to me that's more proof that it did happen. The fact that we have outside accounts of this thing happening that was passed down to generation and generation, one time the earth flooded.
Really, it gives stronger evidence, doesn't it?
It does, because I would call that an unbiased account, because they're not saying, well, the Bible says this, and also we also say this. No, they're just on their own. There's accounts of a flood happening, and so that must have been passed down. But most of those don't give an account of why it happened.
Right.
Just that something happened. And so,
the description of this cataclysmic event.
Yeah.
It shows up in multiple places. And some of them even, I think one of the ways that folks were trying to discredit the Bible, a couple of the flood narratives are, at least they date to a point earlier than when probably the first few books of the Bible were written. Because even though the events took place thousands of
time,
years
yeah.
ago. If Moses is the supposed key author of most of the first 5 books, we're talking 1,500 years before Jesus.
Yeah.
So even a couple of the flood narratives are before that. But if you
They were written down before
yes,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
They found them through archaeology and date them to a couple thousand years before Jesus rather than 1,400 years, and a few come after. But yeah, all of them have multiple parts of the story, like almost line for line the same.
Yeah.
But what is missing is the reasoning behind it, the why behind it.
Yeah. God's part in it.
Correct. It's usually like it could be a divine thing or the gods plural, but there is something along lines of a deity or some being larger than us is mad and they flood the earth, but they rescue, and it's often usually like one family, much like it is in the biblical account, rescue out one family, with the point of then restarting the human existence through this one family after the water is taken care of.
Yeah.
But as far as we can tell, Noah's name is Noah. There aren't any other indications from other sources that his name was something other than that. But I think the significance of his name is his name of rest and comfort is juxtaposed against the decreation and the chaos that comes with the flood, and that God uses the ark to give him rest and comfort, and then after the flood is over, like you said, there's rest and comfort for him in the midst of this horrible thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty cool.
So the next question, Romans talks about the wrath of God. And so how does the wrath of God relate to us being covered by Jesus before God?
Right. Romans 1:18 is probably the verse that brought about this question. This is the beginning of that section that Pastor Ray spoke on a couple weeks ago. This is the immoral, the irreligious, the human side of those who need salvation, and just this downward spiral of humanity as they get worse and worse and worse. And that section begins with this phrase out of verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men," and then describing those men and women, humans, they, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth. And then Paul begins to paint the picture of what that looks like. And we're going to talk about that more in the next question after this. But that wrath of God that's against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men.
And here's a question. Are we, we're obviously not perfect. Are we also revealing the wrath of God in our unrighteousness? There's a distinction between
even those who
now.
are so even if we are in the family of God and we're followers of Jesus, do we still through our own humanity? Well, I think of course so, and that's why we get to chapter 2, which Pastor Ray spoke on a little bit last week, and we're going to hit more this weekend coming up. Chapter 2 is, and those of you who think that chapter 1 isn't about you, it is about you because you also do that. You're guilty of those same things. You just feel judgmental and superior to the people from chapter 1. So you're just as guilty, which is why we're going to get here, folks, in a couple weeks to Romans 3:23, where at the end of all this, Paul says, a verse we all know really well, "For all have sinned, and all fall short." And I was once told that all means all, and that's all means. So it's everybody.
Yeah.
And we're building to that. Paul's building to that case. The wrath of God here that's revealed, and yes, you could say that we maybe are participants of that. The big difference is if we're on the backside of the first 3 chapters of Romans, and we're into chapters 4, the last half of 3 and 4 and 5, when we believe in the gospel message that's been given to us by Jesus, there's this theological concept called propitiation, which describes the fact that once we are in Jesus, he has appeased us. He has made us favorable. He has removed God's wrath from us. In fact, in many senses, he answered God's wrath that's aimed at my sin by taking that on the cross.
Yeah.
So we then believe that we will not experience the wrath of God that's poured out against ungodliness and unrighteousness because we've aligned ourselves to Jesus.
Yeah.
So but even in our justified state, we still do sin, and so therefore we do like bring the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men into the world. But the wrath that God has towards all of that sin, because as His holiness, He cannot be a part of it. The wrath aimed towards that cosmic enemy of His that we often called sin, we don't have to pay the penalty for that.
Yeah.
So that wrath is not going to be aimed at us. By aligning ourselves with Jesus, we escape that.
Yeah.
Is
yeah.
the concept I think that we gain out of, especially out of Romans.
And Romans really does go through a lot of this stuff when he talks about how God's grace abounded because of sin, and you get to Romans 6, which many years ago I had to memorize all of Romans 6.
Good for you.
I
Yeah.
don't remember it anymore, but
Yeah, at one point in time.
at one point in time, and he's talking about, I remember how it starts, should we continue sinning so that grace may increase? By no means.
Right.
And so it's like some people can take that, well, I have freedom in Christ, and so that means I can do whatever I want. And that's where the balance of grace and truth comes in. That's like, yes, we're free, there is grace, but the truth has to be there that you have that grace because someone literally took the punishment.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that it was free, it's that somebody else paid for it. So then our mindset has to shift. Yes, I have freedom, but I have freedom at a cost, and I have to, knowing what somebody did for you changes how you treat them. Not in I did this for you, now you better do this for me, but in a sense of like, you did something so big that I couldn't even think to be able to do. That changes. I don't want now. I want to treat you in such a way. I want you to know, like, my appreciation and everything that goes along with that understanding of it. It's that balance of grace and truth. So there is wrath, and we can't be going around like, well, that wrath's not on me because I'm saved. And some people turn that into a prideful thing, and it's like every time that we sin, it's like putting another nail in. I mean, that's probably a bad analogy, but it cost is something that we can't forget.
Too often, people will use their salvation as strictly fire insurance.
Yes.
Like it's just a get out of jail free card.
Yeah.
And so therefore, and to take advantage of God's grace and say, yeah, I can sin all I want because there's always more grace than there is my sin. And Paul does address that in Romans 6 especially, the ridiculousness of that, because Paul describes us as being slaves to sin prior to Jesus. So why would you go back to that relationship?
Yeah.
Why would you continue to feed that relationship? And when we begin to view our relationship with God through Jesus as not so much I get heaven, don't have to go to hell, but I begin to already participate in this kingdom that will one day be in completion here.
Yeah.
But there's a phrase that they use a lot called "we're in the already but not yet."
Yeah.
So some things are already happening as part of God's kingdom, but it's not yet fulfilled.
Jesus has showed us what could be.
Correct.
And so we want to be a part of that. If that's what we can have, I want to be a part of that. I don't want to keep doing this because that brought me nothing but pain and suffering.
Right. Why would I go back to that abusive relationship that has no good for me at all and only wants to ruin me? And instead, I look for ways for you and me and all of us to continue to help humans flourish in this world and to bring them the good news of more than just I get to go to heaven one day.
Right.
Because even technically that's not what really happens. Heaven comes to us. God creates a new heaven and a new earth, as we talked about in the Worldview series back in December.
So God's not abandoning creation.
No.
He's coming back to fix it.
Redeem it, and restore it. And so I would hope that when I fully understand what Christ did for me and my desire to follow him, I would then want to begin to live in his kingdom now, even if the rest of the world isn't there yet.
Yeah.
I want to be pursuing his kingdom, pursuing his righteousness, not because it has some kind of check mark for me, but it is me living to be most human. In fact, I once heard it said that sin is at its core. Sin is when we fail to be truly human. We were not designed. We're not designed to be that. And so, when you're truly human, you love God and you love others, and you pursue that flourishing of God's kingdom here on earth, even though you know it's not going to happen fully yet.
Yeah.
And when you create that mindset, then you get out of the, well, I said a prayer and I got saved, so now I can kind of live however I want.
Yeah.
It's easy to fall victim to that if you think of it only as fire insurance.
And we had talked about this a while ago, and I was hoping it would come up again at some point, and so I'll just talk about a little bit of it now. But I always think about when people ask, like, well, what rules do I have to follow? Yeah. Well, what's specifically
what's the line that I can get really close to but not cross?
And I feel like that's what it is. It's like, well, because I want to go right there.
Yeah.
That's, and it's either that or I want to use it as a cudgel over somebody else who didn't meet that line. And it's like the rules were never meant to bring about righteousness. The rules were meant to show us how far away we actually are from righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
That's really good. Yeah. Yeah, the how much can I do, how much can I get away with? You're not really comprehending the depth of God's grace and the depth of living for him. So.
Yeah. And that kind of segues into our third question.
Yeah.
Which Roman talks about. It says they were given over to their sins. And so the question is that God condemning them? So when it says he gave them over to them, a lot of times in our minds, I think we think of sin that people are doing that we think is really bad, and then we see somebody get bad consequences because of it, and we immediately think like, God gave you over to your sin, you're getting what you deserve.
Right. What happens when people do what we consider to be sinful things and they flourish for a time? That doesn't seem right and fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like when it talks about God giving them over to their sin, does it sound like God's giving up on them and now they've been condemned?
Right.
And there's no coming back. Is that the essence of the question?
Yeah.
Good. So there's 3 times in Romans 1 where Paul writes that God gave humanity over, or God gave humanity up, not giving up on them, but gave them up to. It's pretty easy to remember, too. It's in verse 24, 26, 28, just those even verses right there in the middle. Verse 24, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. 26, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Verse 28, and since they did not see fit acknowledging God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. So in each of those situations, it sounds like God is giving humanity over to the things that they want to do.
Yeah.
To giving up on them. So one of the great things that is super helpful here is when we recognize that, in fact, I once heard it said that God is a perfect gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
He never forces himself.
Yep.
He never requires someone to love him or to follow him. He desperately desires a relationship, but will never
force it.
Yeah, go over the top to make it happen.
Yeah.
So when humanity wants to pursue the desires that they have that are outside of how they've been designed, Paul even talks about that later on in the chapter, how they're doing unnatural things, not how they were designed to be. God is essentially allowing humanity to pursue their desires and the things that they want to pursue. I think it was C.S. Lewis, maybe. It just sounds like a C.S. Lewis quote, so if some of you find out later it's not him, I apologize. But I thought once he wrote something like this, where he said that in the end, either a person standing for God will say to God, "Your will be done,"
mm-hmm.
or God will say to that individual, "Your will be done."
Yeah.
Like, this is what you wanted anyway. This is what you desired. which kind of removes that whole idea of someone standing before God one day and going, I had no idea, I didn't know, this is all a surprise to me. That there are moments when God will hand people over or allow people to pursue what they want to pursue, the rebellion against him, and essentially allow that to continue to create the chaos that sin creates. And so you're not living how you're designed to live, and it's not that, in fact, God, because of his love, is saying, I'm going to let you go after this. I'm hoping you'll realize this is not what's best for you.
Yeah.
And you would come back to me.
And you look at the Old Testament, when the prophets would talk to the nation of Israel, God wasn't so much sending these nations in to hurt Israel, but when he would consistently tell them, you are going after these other gods, you are going after these other nations and their practices. And so most of the time it was God just saying, if here's God holding back all this stuff, God saying, is this what you want? Okay, I'm going to open the door a little bit and let you have what you want. And that's when those nations would come in. And it never says that it's God sending in the nation to oppress them. It'll talk about how in Judges, for instance, over and over again, it would say, then that judge died, and the people did what was right in their own eyes, and this other nation came in and oppressed them, and they called out to God. And it's over and over again, God is letting them have what they want. He's they were this beacon. They were supposed to be this beacon in the dark world, and when they want to go after this other stuff, at times he says, okay, taste what the other stuff really is. See if that's what you really want. And in regards specifically to this verse in Romans, it reminded me of this in Jeremiah 18. It says, if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it, and if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. And if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build up and plant it, and if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, then I will relent of the good thing that I intended to do. So it's like these people that they're talking about in Romans, they still have a choice. Here's God specifically saying, and he's saying nations, so that's not just the nation of Israel, because God's looking at every nation. Israel was supposed to be the example to the other nations of this is what you can have. And so it's not like God saying, that's it, you're done. At any point, they could choose to come back. There's always time for us. In, I think it's 1 Peter, when it talks about how God's not slow in, as we understand it, in his promises, but he delays it so that all might have the opportunity. So this isn't God condemning these people. It's him saying, if this is what you want, I heard one person say, why does God let bad stuff happen? And he said, I think the reality is it's like God, it would be so much worse, but God holds it back. And so when it says, I will give you what you want, that's God saying, okay, I'm not going to hold this back for you. Here's what you want. This is what you're after. Is that really what you want? And, sometimes the worst thing God can do for us is give us what we ask for.
Yeah. The last couple of weeks, especially this last weekend, Pastor Ray brought up the prodigal sons, calling it the prodigal sons story, because both sons in their own way. And that is very much what the younger son was given. Like, I want this. And the father said, I will give it to you.
And he
hopes that you will recognize that it is not what you really should want.
Yeah.
And, of course, the story ends with the son returning. And that's the hope here that Paul has in Romans is this is the description of what's happening in humanity. The good news that's coming is on the backside of these first couple chapters where we see, and this is the remedy.
Yeah.
This is the way that chapters 1 and 2 are redeemed and solved is through the person of Jesus and what he did on the cross.
Yeah.
So no, to say that this is God giving up and saying, fine, I'm just gonna condemn them and never have any possibility of any kind of redemption and reconciliation. That doesn't seem to be what Paul's going after in this chapter.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So, well, a little shorter today.
We could go longer.
We could find a way to make it more complicated.
Or let you be able to move on with your life.
Yeah.
Hit stop and go do something else.
So if you have any other questions, send them in as you daydream during service. Send us those questions.
Hopefully they won't daydream this weekend coming up.
Yeah. This weekend, one of the best. One of the best.
Well, okay. We'll see. We'll talk about it afterwards.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for your questions, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.